Beneath the killing fields of Plateau State sits one of the largest untapped lithium deposits in sub-Saharan Africa, reserves valued at over $34 billion. And in the same local government areas where security analysts now say armed groups are fighting for control of mining pits, not grazing routes, the 2027 presidential map is quietly being redrawn. Everyone is talking about the Middle Belt as Nigeria's decisive 2027 swing region, the block that could determine whether the presidency stays in the south or returns north. Nobody is asking the question that actually explains why the violence keeps escalating in exactly the local government areas analysts now identify as resource flashpoints. If the so-called farmer-herder crisis in Plateau, Benue, and Nasarawa is increasingly about who controls gold pits and lithium-bearing land, and not just grazing routes, then who is actually benefiting financially from a conflict that political actors keep describing in purely ethnic and religious terms? By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how billions of naira in undisclosed mineral and land interests are shaping the Middle Belt power struggle, and why whoever controls that narrative going into 2027 controls one of the most consequential regions in the country. I will name the specific minerals, the specific local government areas, and the specific intelligence finding that links Plateau's violence directly to mining pit control, a finding most national commentary on this crisis has simply ignored. Before we go further, if you're new here, Niger Brief exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis that mainstream media won't. Whether you're in Abuja, Lagos, Kano, Port Harcourt, or London, this channel is for you. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. To understand why the Middle Belt has become the most analytically important region heading into 2027, you need two separate but converging stories: the political story and the resource story. Most coverage treats them as unrelated. They are not. The political story. Why the Middle Belt matters numerically. Analysts increasingly describe Nigeria's north-central zone, the Middle Belt, as one of the most analytically important regions heading into 2027. It is religiously mixed between Christian and Muslim populations, politically restless, and historically underestimated by the major parties. Unlike the so-called Core North, Middle Belt voters are described by data analysts as less predictable and more responsive to inclusion, performance, and presence on the ground, making the region a genuine swing zone rather than a guaranteed block for any party. The zoning fight. In May 2026, the Southern and Middle Belt Leaders Forum, a coalition including the Middle Belt Forum, Afenifere, Ohaneze Ndigbo Worldwide, and Pandif, issued a communiqué insisting the presidency remain in southern Nigeria for the next term, citing the zoning arrangement as part of Nigeria's democratic culture since 1999. The Middle Belt Forum's explicit alignment with southern leaders rather than with the broader north is itself significant. It reflects a decades-old Middle Belt political identity rooted in resistance to domination by the historic Northern Emirate structure. The historical thread. Middle Belt Forum spokesman Luka Binyat has publicly stated that while other regions were competing for power at independence, the Middle Belt was struggling for freedom from domination by the Fulani Emirate system. That framing matters because it explains why Middle Belt political elites do not automatically align with Northern political consensus, and why coalition builders on all sides are courting the region intensely for 2027.
The resource story. The lithium discovery. Nigeria's lithium deposits, hosted primarily in pegmatite rock formations, are concentrated in Nasarawa, Ekiti, Kwara, Kogi, and Plateau states, a footprint that almost entirely overlaps with the Middle Belt. These reserves have been independently valued at over $34 billion, among the most significant lithium discoveries in sub-Saharan Africa. Nigeria's broader solid minerals sector, gold, lithium, zinc, limestone, coal, and more is valued at over $700 billion. The Violence Resource Link. A 2026 SBM intelligence report cited by Business Day found that violence in Plateau State, long publicly framed as farmer-herder conflict, is increasingly driven by a battle for control of mineral resources, farmlands, and key food supply routes. The report concluded that armed groups are tightening their hold on resource-rich communities and that recent attacks across Barkinladi, Riom, Wase, Bokos, and Mangu have not only displaced residents but are actively redrawing ownership and access to mining pits, agricultural land, and commercial corridors worth millions of naira. Notice the pattern. Every major flashpoint LGA named in the SBM Intelligence Resource Conflict Report, Barkinladi, Riom, Wase, Bokos, and Mangu, is also a documented site of repeated unresolved mass casualty violence since 2022. That is not a coincidence of geography. It is a map of where the money is. To understand how billions in mineral wealth can be quietly fought over while the public conversation stays fixated on ethnic and religious conflict, you need to understand a specific structural flaw in how Nigeria governs its land and its minerals. First, the jurisdictional split. Under Nigeria's constitutional framework, mining licensing is a federal matter, administered through the Ministry of Solid Minerals Development and the Mining Cadastre Office in Abuja. But land control and allocation is fundamentally a local and customary matter, governed by the Land Use Act and administered through state governors and local traditional and community structures. This split creates a structural vacuum. A mining company or broker can hold a federally issued license for a plot of land, while the actual physical control of that land, who can walk on it, farm near it, or extract from it without interference, depends entirely on which armed or political faction dominates the area on the ground. Licensing is federal, land control is local. Security enforcement is diffused across multiple agencies with overlapping mandates and uneven coordination. Second, the regulatory response and its limits. Under Minister of Solid Minerals Development Dele Alake, the federal government has introduced reforms including the establishment of 388 mineral buying centers in 2024 designed to formalize mineral transactions and improve traceability. It has also deployed mining marshals, a specialized enforcement unit drawn from the Nigeria Security and Civil Corps, which by late 2025 had reportedly sealed over 640 illegal mining sites and arrested more than 350 suspects, with over 150 facing prosecution. These are real institutional steps, but they have not stopped the violence in Plateau's mining-rich LGAs, and they have not resolved the fundamental jurisdictional gap that allows armed control of land to function as de facto control of mineral access, regardless of who holds the federal license.
Third, the informal economy that has filled the vacuum. Investigative reporting describes the emergence of middlemen acting as brokers between local title holders and foreign capital, and an expansion of informal subletting of mining licenses. Where governance is weak, fragmented, or circumvented in this way, oversight becomes episodic, prosecutions remain inconsistent, and convictions stay rare. Into that vacuum has surged intense global demand for gold, lithium, and rare earth elements, minerals now central to global technology supply chains and the energy transition.
The result, according to multiple independent analyses, is that what began as opportunistic informal mining has, in several regions, matured into operational dominance by shadow networks with coercive capacity to enforce their control through violence. One specific case illustrates the institutional rot directly. A mining marshal's commander was linked in a police report to 2 billion naira in suspicious transactions, meaning even the enforcement structure created to clean up the sector has not been immune to allegations of capture by the same financial interests it was designed to police. This is the institutional picture that matters for the Middle Belt power struggle. A constitutional framework that separates land control from mineral licensing, a federal enforcement effort that is real but outmatched, and a security vacuum filled by armed groups whose financial incentives increasingly run through mining pits rather than only through grazing disputes. Plateau Governor Mutfwang has gone further than any other Middle Belt political figure in naming this directly, describing the violence not as a clash, but as a deliberate plot to grab land and displace native populations under the cover of an ethnic narrative. Whether or not every observer accepts the genocide framing he uses, his land grab framing is now substantially corroborated by independent intelligence analysis of where the violence concentrates. Let us now connect the resource picture to the 2027 political map. 3 layers of actors are operating simultaneously in the Middle Belt, and their interests do not always align with the labels commonly used to describe them. Middle Belt political elites. Figures aligned with the Middle Belt Forum and similar bodies have a clear electoral incentive, positioning the region as a decisive swing bloc for 2027 increases their leverage in coalition talks with both the ADC-aligned opposition coalition and the ruling APC. Every additional headline about Middle Belt insecurity that frames the federal government as failing to protect the region strengthens the political case for concessions, appointments, security spending, infrastructure commitments to Middle Belt power brokers ahead of the election. This creates an uncomfortable but important observation. Some political actors have an incentive to keep the insecurity narrative alive and visible, even as they publicly demand its resolution, because the unresolved crisis itself is a source of negotiating leverage heading into 2027. State governors, particularly Governor Mutfwang. Caleb Mutfwang, Plateau's PDP governor, has the most direct political exposure. He governs the epicenter of the resource-linked violence, and his administration's credibility heading into any future electoral cycle depends on whether Plateau's mining-rich LGAs stabilize. His land grab framing is also a political tool. It shifts blame toward external armed actors and away from his own administration's security performance, while simultaneously building a case for greater federal security support and resources directed to Plateau specifically. The armed groups and their undisclosed backers. This is the least visible but most financially significant layer. If the SBM intelligence assessment is correct that armed groups are deliberately tightening control over mining pits, farmland, and commercial corridors, then someone is financing, arming, and coordinating that effort, and someone is buying the gold, lithium ore, or other minerals those groups extract or control access to. Investigative reporting describes middlemen brokering between local title holders and foreign capital interests. Those middlemen, and whoever sits above them in the supply chain, are the genuinely silent stakeholders in this story. They have no incentive to speak publicly because their profit model depends on the conflict being described in the media exclusively as ethnic and religious, a framing that draws attention away from the mineral economy entirely. The silent stakeholder nobody names. Mining marshals and the broader federal enforcement apparatus occupy a genuinely ambiguous position. They are simultaneously the institution meant to dismantle the illegal mining economy that fuels this violence and potentially vulnerable to the same financial capture that has compromised licensing and land administration elsewhere in the sector. Their internal integrity, more than any single political statement from Abuja, will determine whether the resource conflict link in Plateau is ever seriously disrupted.
Electoral implications for 2027. If the Middle Belt swing bloc status holds, then whichever coalition, the ADC-anchored opposition or the APC, most credibly demonstrates it can resolve the resource-driven violence in Plateau, Benue, Nasarawa, and Kogi, stands to gain a substantial electoral advantage in a region analysts already describe as more responsive to performance and presence than to identity-based appeals alone. Here is the uncomfortable strategic truth this section has been building toward. As long as the conflict is narrated nationally as herders versus farmers or Muslims versus Christians, it remains a humanitarian tragedy that generates sympathy but limited structural accountability. The moment it is correctly narrated as a fight over mining pits worth billions of naira, it becomes a corruption and governance failure story, one with identifiable financial beneficiaries who can, in principle, be investigated, sanctioned, and prosecuted. That reframing is precisely why this version of the story has struggled to break through. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know your reaction before we get to the part that changes everything. The Middle Belt resource conflict link has implications well beyond Plateau, Benue, and Nasarawa. Federal-state balance of power. The jurisdictional split between federal mineral licensing and local land control is not unique to the Middle Belt. It is a national structural flaw. Any state with valuable solid mineral deposits and weak local security capacity is vulnerable to the same dynamic. Armed actors establishing de facto control over resource-rich land faster than federal licensing or state-level land administration can respond. Zamfara's gold banditry economy is the most cited precedent. Plateau's lithium and gold belts are now following a similar trajectory. Economic consequences for ordinary Nigerians. Nigeria's formal mining sector contributed just 0.72% of GDP as of 2023, with total formal output estimated at roughly 401 billion naira, a figure independent analysts regard as a dramatic undercount of actual extraction activity nationally. The gap between Nigeria's mineral endowment, valued above $700 billion in total potential, and its actual formal contribution to the economy is not explained by geology. It is explained by governance failure, and the Plateau case shows precisely how that failure operates. Violence displaces communities, disrupts farming and legitimate mining alike, and routes the actual mineral wealth through informal and frequently violent channels that generate no tax revenue, no royalties, and no accountable economic benefit for the citizens who live on top of the resource. Interfaith and interethnic dimensions. This is the most sensitive and most important point in this entire analysis. The Christian-Muslim, Berom Fulani framing of Plateau's violence is not fabricated. There is a genuine decades-old history of religious and ethnic tension in the Middle Belt that predates the current mineral economy. But when a conflict has both a genuine identity-based dimension and a financial dimension that benefits from the identity framing remaining the exclusive public narrative, responsible analysis has an obligation to name both rather than collapsing the story into pure genocide or pure resource conflict. The evidence supports a conflict where ethnic and religious tension provides the social cover and mobilization structure, while resource control increasingly provides the financial motive and strategic targeting logic. Security implications. If armed groups are increasingly motivated by mineral pit control rather than purely communal grievance, the security response required is fundamentally different. Community policing and traditional conflict mediation approaches, appropriate for managing genuine farmer-herder disputes over grazing routes, are insufficient against organized groups with commercial financial backing and the coercive capacity to hold mining sites by force. This requires the kind of specialized, intelligence-led, financial investigative security response that Nigeria has struggled to deploy consistently, even against documented organized criminal mining networks. International and diaspora dimension. Nigeria's lithium and critical minerals sector sits directly inside the global energy transition supply chain, the same battery material demand driving major international mining investment commitments, including over $1.2 billion in lithium processing investments secured or commissioned since 2024.
International investors and trade partners considering Nigerian solid minerals opportunities need to understand that the same resource-rich corridors attracting global capital are in several documented cases also the sites of unresolved mass casualty violence and unclear on-the-ground control. This also connects to a continental pattern. Critical mineral-driven conflict has been documented across the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, and parts of the Sahel, where global demand for energy transition minerals has intensified rather than reduced local armed conflict in the absence of strong governance.
The strongest counter-argument to this analysis deserves a fair hearing before it is examined. Strongest argument. This is primarily an ethnic and religious conflict, and the resource angle is secondary. Defenders of the conventional framing point out correctly that farmer-herder tensions in the Middle Belt predates the current mining boom by decades, has deep historical roots in land use patterns and migration, and has repeatedly produced mass casualty violence, the 2023 Plateau massacres that killed roughly 200 people, the April 2025 Zitake attack that killed 52, in years and locations where mineral extraction was not the central dynamic. On this view, treating the conflict primarily as a resource war risks erasing a genuine, long-standing pattern of ethnic and religious violence that communities have experienced and named for years, including credible claims of targeted attacks on Christian farming communities. This argument has real weight, and it should not be dismissed. The historical pattern of farmer-herder violence in Plateau is well documented independently of any mineral angle, and minimizing the ethnic and religious dimension would be both inaccurate and disrespectful to affected communities who have consistently named that dimension themselves. Where the counter-argument falls short. The issue is not whether the ethnic and religious dimension is real. It is. The issue is whether that dimension fully explains the specific recent escalation pattern identified by independent intelligence analysis, attacks concentrated in mineral-rich LGAs, direct assaults on mining sites themselves, and a documented shift towards armed groups establishing control over mining pits and commercial corridors rather than only grazing land. A conflict can have multiple reinforcing drivers simultaneously. The historical ethnic and religious tension provides the social architecture and mobilization network. The mineral economy increasingly provides the financial incentive and the specific targeting logic for where and when violence escalates. Treating these as mutually exclusive explanations rather than overlapping ones is the actual analytical error made by commentators on every side of this debate. Misconception 1. This is just cattle rustling and grazing disputes. This significantly understates the scale and organization involved. Attacks on mining sites that kill 7 to 12 people in a single coordinated raid, abduct survivors, and seize mined minerals are not grazing disputes. They are armed commercial raids. Misconception 2. The government has no idea resources are involved. Also inaccurate. Governor Mutfwang has publicly named land grabbing as the core agenda behind the killings since at least April 2025. The gap is not awareness, it is the translation of that awareness into a coordinated federal-state security and economic response that treats the violence as its resource-driven organized crime it substantially is, alongside its genuine ethnic and religious dimension.
Here are the 3 specific signals that will determine how the Middle Belt resource conflict story and its 2027 political implications develop in the coming months. 1. Whether federal mining license records for Plateau, Nasarawa, and Benue are made public. If the Ministry of Solid Minerals Development or the Mining Cadastre Office publishes a transparent, geo-mapped register of who holds licenses in the specific LGAs identified as conflict hotspots, Bakinladi, Riom, Wase, Bokos, Mango, that is a meaningful transparency step that allows journalists and civil society to cross-reference license holders against the armed actors controlling those areas on the ground. If that data remains opaque or difficult to access, the resource conflict link will remain easy for political actors to deny publicly even while privately acknowledging it. 2. The outcome of the mining marshal's corruption allegation. The reported 2 billion naira suspicious transactions case against a mining marshal's commander is a direct test of whether Nigeria's enforcement apparatus can police itself. Watch for whether this case proceeds to a transparent investigation and, if warranted, prosecution, or whether it quietly disappears from public reporting. Its outcome will signal whether the federal anti-illegal mining enforcement effort has the institutional integrity to match its stated ambitions. 3. How Middle Belt political coalitions position on security versus resource governance ahead of 2027. Watch whether Middle Belt Forum, Afenifere, Ohaneze, and Pandef joint advocacy, currently framed around zoning and electoral integrity, begins explicitly naming the mineral resource dimension of regional insecurity in their public communiques. A shift from purely ethnic religious framing to a combined security and resource governance framing in elite political messaging would indicate the financial dimension of this story is breaking into mainstream political discourse, increasing pressure for a more serious federal response before the 2027 election cycle. What civil society and the reform movement need to do is specific. Investigative journalists and organizations like CBM Intelligence, the Center for Democracy and Development, and international groups tracking conflict minerals should produce a joint, geo-mapped public data set linking documented attack sites to known and suspected mining activity in the Middle Belt. Without that public evidence base, every political actor in this story retains plausible deniability, and the conflict continues to be discussed in Abuja almost entirely in the language of ethnic and religious tension, even as the money quietly moves through entirely different channels. We started with a question. If the Middle Belt crisis is increasingly about who controls mining pits worth billions of naira, who actually benefits from a conflict that political actors keep describing in purely ethnic and religious terms? The honest answer has several layers. Armed groups benefit directly through control of land and extracted minerals. Middlemen and brokers benefit by monetizing informal access to those minerals without the scrutiny that transparent formal mining attracts. And uncomfortably, some political actors on every side of the Middle Belt's zoning and coalition battles benefit indirectly, because an unresolved security crisis generates exactly the kind of regional leverage that translates into appointments, resources, and bargaining power heading into 2027. None of this erases the genuine, decades-old ethnic and religious dimension of Middle Belt conflict, and no serious analysis should claim it does. But a conflict cannot be fully addressed if its financial architecture remains invisible to the public conversation deciding how to respond to it. What ordinary Nigerians in the Middle Belt and beyond can do is specific. Demand transparent public mining license registers. Support independent journalism and intelligent organizations mapping the resource conflict link. Pressure state and federal lawmakers to close the jurisdictional gap between federal mineral licensing and local land security enforcement, and refuse to let any political coalition, North, South, or Middle Belt, treat this crisis as a useful talking point rather than a governance failure demanding an actual solution. A conflict that profits some of the people responsible for resolving it will never be resolved by asking them nicely to try harder. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.